Okay, hi everybody. Welcome, and also welcome to anyone who's watching online, because this session is part of our AGU Go session, which means that we actually can have questions from anybody online. We can also have questions from anybody in the audience who would like to ask an anonymous question. If they don't want to come up to the mic, you can do so using the AGU app or online, and there'll be some more information that goes up on the screen towards the panel discussion end of the session. So the way this is going to work, we have 4 great speakers. We're going to have each of them come up and present, and I'd like everybody to hold their questions until we get to the discussion session. But you can still submit your questions on the online social Q&A if you'd really like to ahead of time. And then I'll invite our remaining panelists up, and they can introduce themselves a little bit and tell you a bit about their great work, and then we'll start with their discussion. So our first speaker today is Marianne OBrien, and she's going to introduce us to the topic of implicit bias. And this is a big subject. We're not going to cover everything today, but I would love for people to, since we're talking about implicit and conscious thinking, to actually consciously commit to take some of these tools away with them and employ them in their everyday work. So, Marianne.
Is there anybody in here who hasn't heard of implicit bias? You're all educated folks. So that's good, because I hadn't planned on doing a lot of training on implicit bias. I assume that the folks in this room would be savvy enough to avoid that. Where's it come from? Do I have it? Should I do something about it? Implicit bias also comes by a lot of names. It's AKA, also known as subconscious bias, implicit assumptions. You've probably heard it referred to in a number of different ways. All of these have in common subconscious, unconscious, unexamined, hidden, or implicit, meaning that something is happening in our brain and the thinking process that's below the level of consciousness. And you also see the terms assumptions, beliefs, attitudes, and sometimes bias. Bias, I think, has a negative connotation for many of us, and so it's okay to say assumptions, beliefs, or attitudes. Not all implicit assumptions are negative or have a negative impact on other people, but they are all part of the way our brain works. So how can we know that something implicit exists if it's below the level of consciousness? Well, the original evidence came from memory studies where test subjects were given lists of words, and they were allowed to remember what words they could recall, but then given prompts the next day, they could remember more words than they could originally. And this has expanded to brain and cognition studies, how we learn. And now neuroscience is catching up. We're starting to see how this actually works in terms of lighting up different areas of the brain. So conscious means anything, an explicit brain activity that is verbally reportable, so you know you're thinking about it. Whereas unconscious is not verbally reportable. It's something going on in your brain, but not necessarily something that you can pull out and describe in words. And I've seen a lot of different estimates for how much brain activity is happening below the level of consciousness. And some numbers I've heard on the Brain Science podcast are around 85% or more of our brain activity happens below the level of consciousness. And I'm personally glad that my brain doesn't tell me whenever it's squeegeeing something out of the pancreas into my intestines, for example. All right, so just as some examples of things that go on below the level of consciousness, how do we gauge distances, localize a sound, drive on an empty road, complete the phrase war and peace, there you go. Provide the sum 2 + 2 equals. Or I see a lion, should I run? All of these are very instantaneous things that we don't have to put a lot of mental effort into. But when we think about thinking, what we think of when we think of thinking is conscious thinking, such as dig into your memory for the name of an acquaintance, walk faster than your normal pace for a sustained period of time. You really have to be thinking about that. Park in a tight parking space, give someone your phone number, which you never call, or provide large sums. So this kind of thinking, what we think of when we think of thinking, is very energy intensive. So you know that if you've sat at your desk all day working on a paper or analyzing data, you are tired and hungry at the end of the day. And they see that the brain may be taking up 40 to 50% of all of our caloric expenditure in a given day, especially if we're engaging in conscious thinking. Implicit thinking is simple, it's easy, it's lazy, it doesn't take any effort to do these things. What's problematic is the impact of implicit bias, and this, I think you've probably all seen research that demonstrates the impact of implicit bias, and I'm just going to show you one example today. You've probably heard of studies that make up application names and then they put a man's name on half of the application and a woman's name on the other half. This is a study by Mas Rakusen and all that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences a few years ago. And they sent this mythical application for a lab manager position to about 127 US men and women in STEM departments at large R1 universities. Because implicit assumptions, associations, thinking, biases are derived from the culture around us, both men and women faculty will share the same biases. They are both more likely to want to hire the male applicant, who was called John in the study. They found John more competent, so rated on a Likert scale of 1 to 5. John was rated more competent, more hireable, more worthy of mentoring. And both men and women faculty offered John a higher starting salary. And this graph shows the salaries that were being offered, women faculty on the left and men faculty on the right. You can see that women faculty offered Jennifer a pretty low starting salary compared to the male faculty, or compared to offering John a higher starting salary. And then men faculty offered higher starting salaries overall. But they also offered a little bit more to John as well as Jennifer. And this is an example of the impact of implicit bias. So we share the bias that when I say the word scientist, most of us think of a white guy in a white lab coat with something dangerous in his hand. Okay. Even though none of us actually looks like that. There are so many studies that I decided to, rather than go through them, I will provide references at the end of the talk. The field of law has provided numerous studies on how both white and non-white juries are more apt to find people of color guilty rather than non-guilty. There's differential sentencing where people of color are more likely to get a harsher sentence. In medicine, the decisions to treat and whether to do so with aggressive treatments is quite biased by race and to some extent by gender. In hiring, we know that people of color or women or white mothers need more qualifications to be hired. It's pretty interesting that in our culture, studies show that white mothers are expected to be at home with the children, but black mothers aren't. Teaching and learning, the underlying assumptions of math and reading abilities. Letters of recommendation, we have Kuheli Dut speaking in a little bit on the panel, and she's shown how letters of recommendation written for women and people of color are weaker. They have weaker descriptors, they have more personal comments. Oops, wrong direction. And student evaluations in online courses, female students, those who have a female instructors that have a female name are judged more negatively than instructors with a male name. And if you've ever seen any of the evaluations for people of color, nobody should tolerate the hideous vitriol that you can see. So the thing is that we learn a lot of stuff without knowing that we're learning it. We pick it up from the culture, we pick it up from the prevailing milieu. Here's an experiment by Kenneth and Mamie Clark in the 1930s. They filmed some children and asked these children a series of questions. They were offered a white doll and a black doll. Today we might consider these leading questions, but they asked the children things like, Which is the good doll? Which is the bad doll? And then the final question was, which doll looks like you? And you can see the pain and stress on this poor child's face as he picks up a white doll that says it looks like him because he's already pre-identified the black doll as the bad doll. These experiments were actually used in Brown versus the Board of Education to overturn segregated schools in the United States. That ruling was the year that I was born, and I was in high school before Atlanta began to implement this, and the Atlanta public schools. And we really thought that if kids started out in kindergarten and went through school together for 15 or 16 years, that at the other end, everything would have been fixed by now. So look at our country today, and you can see that that isn't working. Do you have implicit biases? I'm afraid the answer is yes. If you have a brain, the way the brain has learned is by picking up implicit assumptions in our culture. So we can't get rid of our implicit bias. We can take the Harvard Implicit Association test and see how biased we are, but we can't go back after learning about this or training or whatever and see that our scores get better. We are biased all the time, and the more stressed, tired, hungry we are, the more implicit thinking is going to take over, because real thinking, conscious thinking, it's not real, it's conscious thinking, is so energy intensive. So what we want to do is reduce the impact of our implicit biases, and we're still working on how to do that. But the first thing we need to do is just be willing to acknowledge that this is reality. These multiple studies, and now, as I mentioned, neuroscience catching up, is real. Daniel Kahneman, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, says we're actually more apt to recognize implicit thinking, implicit bias thinking, in somebody else rather than in ourselves. So if we can agree in a meeting to allow ourselves to be called out for implicit bias, there's less of a chance that it will have a negative impact on the outcomes. And I'm big on creating structures to minimize impact. We can't rely on our self-control, our will to overcome this. And I'll show you what I mean by creating structures that minimize the impact in just a moment. But it will involve focusing on policy and practices, and to hold participants in any decision-making process accountable. Decision-making, neuroscience demonstrates that our decision-making is largely unconscious, and that our brain has started firing rapidly making associations when it comes time to make a decision at least 10 milliseconds before we can verbally report what our decision-making process is. And so by the time we come to a decision, our unconscious mind has already made its mind up. And so actually much of our conscious decision-making is justification for the intuition, the intuitive decisions that we have made. So an example of creating a structure, so for example, for an evaluative committee, so for determining who's going to win an award, who are we going to hire for our next hire, who's going to get the graduate student stipends. Before any evaluation begins, we need to establish clear criteria for the selection. You cannot wait until people have looked at the applications, their unconscious minds have already picked out their friends, their buddies, someone who went to my school or what have you. What are the criteria? You need to be very explicit. Excellence is not a criterion. Contributions are not a criterion. You need to explain what that is. You need to make sure that the criteria themselves are not inherently biased. SATs, letters of recommendation, publication metrics like H-index are all biased. They're biased by gender in particular. So you create some kind of evaluative rubric and you stick to it. Somebody on the committee should be assigned to making sure that the conversation is not veering off course. You don't get to peek at the applications until the criteria are established. And as I said, someone in charge ensures everyone gets to speak, no one is interrupted, no one dominates the conversation. And did I mention holding people accountable is a great way to reduce implicit biases, the impact of implicit biases. For example, if a dean cancels a search for a faculty member because the search committee continues to come up with short lists that are not diverse, that will send a message. Success, by the way, is made, not predicted. What actually predicts the success of faculty or graduate students or employees? It's the guidance, mentorship, and resources that they are provided. So once you reach a certain level of expertise, it's how you are mentored through the process that is going to determine whether you are a success or not. And for a great example of implicit bias, look up Washington Post's story on how Payless Shoes opened up this boutique called Palessi Shoes and was able to charge $400 to $1,000 for shoes, for their $30 shoes. And I'd like to end with a quote from Jocelyn Nicole Johnson, who wrote in The Guardian this week about an art project in Charlottesville that is aimed at healing the town. She says, the root of this injury being racism, we could substitute sexism or any other kind of ism, the root of this injury is by design. And so it seems fitting that if we can design harm, we can also design recovery. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. Our next speaker is going to be Brooks Hansen, and he's going to talk about the really great work they're doing at AGU Publications to look into co-author networks. And yeah, I'll let him tell you all about it.
Great. Thank you very much. Where's the... Okay, just drive. Okay, there's not a clicker. Okay, thanks. So it's really a great honor to be here, and particularly a great honor to follow Marianne, who's done so much work to bring attention to implicit bias over the many years. So what we'd like to do is, it's a little bit sobering, but talk about how implicit bias is, we would propose, explicitly encoded in the structure of how we do science. And what that means is that to address implicit bias, the training and awareness and other efforts will only go so far. We actually have to address the underlying structural problem, and that's related to networks and how networks form and persist over the careers. And that makes the problem harder on one sense, because it's really in the structure of how we do science. It's not just a training awareness problem. But we'll have some encouraging, hopeful approaches at the end. So let me say this work is actually, I'm representing much other work by many of the co-authors, and with a slight shout out to PBS or NPR, it's really possible through the membership at AGU. We have a very special data set that is almost unique thanks to the contributions of our members who provided age and gender information. And this is absolutely essential because we all know that there's been an age-related bias of participation in gender in our sciences over time. And so to disambiguate what is actually gender bias, explicit or implicit, one needs to pull out the age information. And the AGU has had, through that contributions and the self-declaration of members used anonymously, has just a really rich and fantastic data set. So this is in many ways a thank you to you. It's special across the sciences, and it's really been valuable in studying this. So just, Marianne did a great job of this. We should actually expect implicit bias. This is a long-standing longitudinal study called Dry Scientist Test. It's been conducted to elementary school children for a very long time. This was a study in 1983 after it had been run for a long time. And you can see that 5,000 elementary school students mostly drew male scientists. The slightly good news is that this was repeated more recently. A study came out in 2015, and the percentage of women scientists that were drawn had increased to 34%, and women actually drew more than half women scientists. So you might say, oh, that's that's elementary school students. This is a study, it's a little more complicated than drawing, but was given to a large number of undergraduate majors. The y-axis here goes from 0, which is no implicit bias, it's kind of a questionnaire and study, up to basically an increase in the relative implicit bias going up on the y-axis. The x-axis goes from humanities, so students in the humanities, to the hard sciences to the right. And basically you can see that women basically decreased their implicit bias in the study as they became in more science majors, whereas men increased it. So that's people that are becoming graduate students. So just a reminder of some of the things that we have done. Jory Lurbach, who unfortunately is giving a talk in a parallel session right now, led a study where we looked at implicit bias in the peer review process for AGU journals, and we showed that women were used less as reviewers. We did a follow-up study where we actually put a reminder of this bias in all of our journals, and the participation of reviewers, as I'll show in the next slide, increased. Also, the decline to review rate dropped significantly and has continued to drop this year. That's probably partly the result of awareness of this, but we actually think we're getting better reviewers also as a result of this, and therefore we're getting fewer first declines. And some other results are listed there. What we've seen as a steady increase, as we've made our editors and authors aware of this, of the proportion of reviewers or women that were used as reviewers. The bottom two graphs are suggestions by male authors and then male editors, and who the male editors actually invite, and the top two graphs are suggestion by female corresponding authors and invited. So you might say, oh great, some of this training and other aspects has worked, but notice that we're still seeing a difference of 5% between suggestions by men and suggestion by women. So we wanted to explore a little bit more why that is, and this is robust across many other studies. For example, Heather Ford and a group in Cambridge University has been working with us to analyze similar aspects in our meetings, and this is invitations as invited speakers in meetings like this one. And this was published last year in Nature Communications. They also found about a similar 4 or 5% difference. And this has been in many other studies. Those are kind of in the earth and space sciences, but we see this across many other sciences as well, and many other studies. So many studies show similar effects in invitations to women, whether as reviewers, invited speakers, and so forth. And so we have a hypothesis. So some of this is a result of training and awareness, but this is also partly a network effect, and that's a lot harder to overcome. So what we did is we took our fall meeting data from 2014 to 2018, so including this meeting. There's about 25,000 abstracts a year representing over 100,000 authors, because there's co-authors included in there. And there's more, when we disambiguate this is more than 1 million unique author-author connections that include age, country of origin, and gender. Thank you all again. And we can look at how differences vary by age. I'm not going to show significant intervals on this, but we have a very large data set. The differences we're going to show are significant. And we compare with publications data, and we can do lots of other fun things. So the graphs, how I'm going to get to one summary graph, I just want to talk you through that so you understand that. So this is the cumulative network of 20-year-old women. And the percentage here there's age, decades on the x-axis, on the y-axis is percentage of the total population here. In future graphs, it'll be percent women in the population. But so you can see on the right, let me start on the right, so a 20-year-old woman has a network that includes cumulative of people of all ages, but predominantly in their 30s is kind of the highest number of co-authors. And of that, the blue bar represents that of the total population, about 10% are women and 20% of that network are men out of the total population. So the data on the left is the same graph It's the same data plotted just slightly differently in a different bar graph. And what we've added here is the blue bars are what we would expect from the entire, if they were interacting equally with the entire AGU membership of women, and the orange bar for men. So you can see that the 30-year-olds, a 20-year-old woman is interacting with slightly more 30-year-old women than we might expect, and slightly more 30-year-old men than we might expect from the overall AGU population. So we can take that a little bit further. So this is still 20 to 29-year-old women, and if we look within each age cohort, so the graph on the inset graph is the same one you saw. If we look within each age cohort, you can see that, let's take the 30-year-olds, there's 10% and 20%, so overall that's for a 20-year-old woman interacting with the 30-year-old population, you can see that that's about 33%. Women in that population of 30-year-olds, and so on across. And so what you're seeing is the historic age-related bias in the main chart of women in our field. And again, the blue bars are what we would expect from the overall AGU membership if they were just interacting with at random. And so we can do the same thing for men. So this would be a 20 or 29-year-old men, and then this is the cumulative population. Out of that 1 million co-author networks, we have 66 or so thousand here. And it's the same plot, and I'm going to focus on the plots on the left now, and we could put these together. And so this is the networks of men in gray, of 20-year-old men in gray and 20-year-old women, related to the proportion of other co-authors they have at each decade. And then the blue bar is what we would expect that proportion to be if they interacted on average with, well, this is the proportion of women, but the inverse is the proportion of men in our AGU community, so the entire AGU database. So again, you can see the difference here is, for 20-year-olds, is about 4 or 5% over all age cohorts. And so we can do this across every age cohort. I'm not going to go up to the higher ones because they all show the same. And basically, what you see is what you get across all of these. So the 30-year-olds interaction network is kind of similar. They're all pretty much similar, and there's a 4 or 5% difference across all of these cohorts in the networks of men and women. And in most cases, the networks of men and women are pretty much what we would expect them to be at random. So I'm going to focus on the graph on the right here. Obviously, these networks form over age. So many of the networks that people form when they're 20 persist, but they also grow as we move around. And so one way of looking at this is kind of the abstracts per person. So this counts not first authors, but all authors on abstracts. And you can see that if you just look at 20 and 30-year-olds, there's essentially a doubling of the number of abstracts per person, and that's partly a network effect. And then there's not quite a doubling again over the career. So, but you still form networks as you age. It's just that many of them are formed in the early part of your career and then persist. Or more than half of them are formed in the early part of your career. We can also take this then and look at some acceptance rates. And here we've taken the subset where we have data on all of the co-authors of papers and whether they were accepted. So the graphs on the left are for women first authors, the graphs on the right are for male first authors. And you can see a couple things. So Jory found in the earlier work that unlike actually most other fields, women in the Earth and Space Science first author papers have a higher acceptance rate than men. We can't say that it shouldn't be higher still, but it's very unusual in the Earth and Space Sciences compared to what's been found in most other disciplines. But what we also have looked at now is some other network effects, and you can see the dramatic effect of including a diverse team, and I'll come back to that in a second, in networks on acceptance rate. And so we can look at a number of other effects of networks. So you can imagine a network that is group size, the bigger the author team, is there a better acceptance rate? Yes. International collaboration, if there's a more diverse international collaborating team, is there a higher acceptance rate? Yes. And is it diverse in age? Is there a higher acceptance rate? Yes. I don't want to say that this is completely apples to apples on how we do this, because what the increment is here is slightly different for each of these, in the increment of how you calculate it and so forth. And we're using a smaller sample here, so there's a larger statistical uncertainty. But it's interesting that gender diversity, having a diverse authorship team in terms of gender, and we presume this replicates for other diversity, makes a big difference. So I said, the encouraging news is if this is explicitly encoded in a network effect, here's some evidence that diverse networks help science. And so if we want to actually break or improve the diversity of our networks and say that that is good for implicit bias, isn't it great that it's also better for science and science acceptance rate? So there's some ways that maybe we might think about how to form and foster diverse networks, particularly among younger scientists, but having that be good for our science certainly helps. So in conclusion, implicit bias is widespread in the peer review process. We should expect it to be, as Marianne said. Explicit reminders of this bias help, but they don't solve the problem. Having women involved as editors, session conveners, and in other leadership roles clearly makes a difference. But doesn't solve things. But one likely reason that actually having women involved is that their networks are different and are more representative of the overall population. And male networks are biased towards other males, even among students, early career researchers. So this bias is still being baked in. We're seeing it in our youngest cohorts, which will make it a continuing challenge to address in the future unless we address the network and promote diverse networks. And the final thing, the encouraging thing is diverse co-authors are associated with an increased likelihood of acceptance, so there should be a positive feedback there that we can leverage. So just to note that some additional resources are on AGU Ethics and Equity Center, including a large collection of implicit bias training and efforts that was actually produced by UCLA originally, but they've given us a license to do it, so you can also look at UCLA. And thank you.
Okay, so we're holding questions until the panel, but this is a good chance to remind you of, so you can ask questions online using the AGU app. You can find where to do this. It's, if you look for our session in the program and you scroll down, you'll see social Q&A. And if you click that, it'll take you to this page you can see up here, and you can ask an online anonymous question that we will get to in the panel discussion. Okay, so our next speaker is going to be Ria Roper-Ned, and she's going to talk to us about the McNair Scholars Program and the processes that make it a successful program. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you for being here and joining this session, because this session is what I would say is a social justice initiative. When we speak about diversity, of course, it addresses me in my own personal experience, but it truly is about the experience and the climate that we're living in today. If you haven't heard, since we're talking about implicit bias and the workings of our brains, I do have an accent, which means that I came here when I was very young, and that's relevant to this discussion on implicit bias, because when I moved here, my family moved to a predominantly white county in Maryland, and I still live there today. It's home. But I was always that little black girl in orchestra. I play the viola, and I still play the viola till today. And I come from a family of competitive swimmers, and so I was one of the very few swimmers of color. And that doesn't mean that persons of color can't swim, but it's just about the access and opportunities, right? And so also, just because of my history and my background and my experience, I also had to have questions and raise questions about why certain things happened or why decisions were made. And so my experience very much, in some ways, mirrored that of my students. I'm coming to you from the University of Maryland and as a graduate of the University of Maryland. But my experience really is with TRIO programs and or students who are of low income and first generation students. TRIO essentially has established what's called a pipeline or a pathway for students from middle school through the post-baccalaureate experience. And so I'm coming to you really from the McNair Scholars Program at the University of Maryland. The objective of the McNair Scholars Program essentially is to work with students who are identified as low-income and first-generation students. However, McNair is one of the only TRIO programs that has an eligibility requirement where students can also come from groups that are traditionally underrepresented in higher education. And our mission is essentially to prepare students not only to get them through their undergraduate programs of study, but more so to prepare them and give them access to opportunities so that they can truly persist and retain in doctoral programs of study. So what we do essentially, first and foremost, is to ensure that we have a multi-stakeholder approach. We assume and understand what our stakeholders are looking for and need, specifically our students, and then to ensure that our objectives are established, that they are ambitious and attainable and consistent with the institution in which we're a part of. And so that's what we have done to start off, and to make our program effective, we have established a set of objectives that we deem are ambitious and attainable based on international trends, national trends, as well as our institution. The McNair Scholars Program essentially has two major components: a summer research experience as well as lunch and learn lectures. We always say once you're a McNair Scholar, you're always a McNair Scholar, meaning that it does not end with one of our major components, which is the Summer Research Institute. I will continue to remind you about the context of the students that we're working with and their demographics, because that is very important and significant in terms of the policies, programs, the objectives that we've established, as well as the services and interventions that we provide. So during the summer, we bring students on campus. Of course, it's a competitive program. It's high academic achievers. But we are bringing students on campus, and we're giving them a 6-week research opportunity. It's paid. Again, I want you to be reminded that the students are coming from low background, low income status, and so we are asking them to forego 6 weeks of an opportunity in which they would have traditionally been working, and working to meet basic needs, right? Not just luxurious needs, but really basic needs. And so the students are being paid while they're here on campus with us. They have the opportunity, and we are helping them identify research mentors. We are giving them housing and meals. We're not asking them to dip into their pockets for those needs. We're introducing them to graduate school application process through a graduate school seminar. We are paying for a 2-credit research methods course for them, and we are helping them and guiding them to develop research articles, a scholarly article, and also training them on how to conduct oral and research presentations. During the academic year lunch and learn lectures, we address more so than some of the non-cognitive pieces in terms of their development. And so through this workshop, I have 2 major objectives. The first is for us to understand the impact of implicit bias and biases on underrepresented groups and underrepresented populations, and then to share with you some of the interventions and services that we have developed, as well as what research has suggested works best for underrepresented students to truly help them create a sense of belonging, create a safe space for them, and to help them persist and retain in undergraduate programs of study, and more so to matriculate into doctoral programs of study. We've heard the definition already, and I'm very much consistent with that, the definition that I'm using. When we speak of implicit bias, we're looking at the attitudes or the stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. But my argument here more so is that because of implicit bias, we are also demonstrating inscriptions of power. Because of those biases, we have created hierarchical structures, we have created systems in which we're granting privilege to some, or we've identified certain things, behaviors, and attitudes as normative and others as deviant. And so I'm going to ask you to reach a bit here. I know you're aware of W.E.B. Du Bois, and he has this theory on double consciousness, and he speaks truly about Black folk, but for this moment, I want you to, let's talk about what this theory is. The theory of double consciousness speaks and says that Black folk are able to view the world through their own lens, the way they experience the world, but they're also able to assume a dual consciousness, where so because of the stereotypes that exist about them or of them, that they too can view the world or understand how the world may view them, all right? So the two lenses, the two senses of self or concepts of self and understandings of self. So because of the concept of double consciousness, and I will argue that we can truly apply that theory today, there's a psychology that comes along with the deficit stereotypes that are perpetuated amongst or about certain groups. And those stereotypes result in feelings of withdrawal or alienization, just feelings of not belonging as a whole. And so some of the services and interventions is to understand that we still live in an age in which double consciousness exists, and there are understandings of the negative stereotypes. And so one of the first things I would suggest that we do, and what we have done with our program, is to create a safe space for the students. We first and foremost have to acknowledge that these biases exist, and so what we are trying to do and what we have to intentionally and consciously do is try to change our understandings and or the language or assumptions that are made. We're asking our brain to rewire itself, as hard as difficult as it may be, we're suggesting that we do that. So when we see the taxable income of a student and we understand that they are truly of low income status, we're not looking at them as poor, but we're looking at them as resilient and or grateful. A student who traditionally will be thought of as being at risk, we're saying they're able to persevere. An underprivileged student is truly one who is looking for an opportunity and so forth. What we're doing is essentially creating a safe space, because in the same way in which we internalize, or anyone can internalize, a deficit stereotype, we're truly trying to create a more asset-based understanding of the individuals and the students that we're working with, and to increase their sense of self. We're trying to validate their experiences, their academic as well as their personal experiences, and to build relationships of trust. One of the key and central aspects of our program is the role of mentors and mentorship. We identify both peer and faculty mentors for the students, essentially just a support network for the students, again, building on that concept of trust. And we are encouraging their mentors to share their experiences and their lessons with the students, to monitor the students and to intervene once there is a sign of challenge from both an academic as well as a personal side. What's important, however, again, we're coming back to the psychological impact of the mentors and or these biases, is that we truly identify a group of mentors that are reflective of the population and the demographics of the students that we're working with, because it's important from the psychological perspective that if someone, a mentor, someone in a position of authority, comes from my background, can truly thrive, then I can too. Considering that the students are also first-generation students, however, we cannot assume that they are able to make these connections on their own and know how to do it. So this is where we come in again as faculty, staff, and as administrators. We are helping them to initiate these communications. I learned this one time when I sent a student out and I said, I've identified a faculty mentor for you. Please go and communicate with them and introduce yourself. The door closed, the student left, the door opened, the student came back in and said, Dr. Ned, I don't know what to say. And in that instance, this is when I help them with a communication prompt. Come in, let's sit down, let's develop this email together. And I promise you that student has not walked back into my office asking for assistance on that particular topic again, how to introduce themselves to a potential mentor. We also provide our students with a contract so they understand the expectations, but we do the same thing for our faculty mentors. So we will always encourage that we have very clear expectations from students as well as those that are interacting with them. The faculty have an understanding of what the deliverables are. During the Summer Research Institute, while they're leading the students and guiding the students on research, we have expressed to them that it is important for them to work jointly on some scholarly article or something that can be used as a writing sample as they're applying to graduate programs of study. We share with them what the time commitment is, what research says the students truly need to become effective researchers in their particular disciplines. We ask them to provide oversight and accountability, hold the students accountable to their progress. The faculty mentors are key. They are the key component to allowing students to have access to research opportunities. They are the ones that are introducing the students to discipline-specific research as well as research methods. They understand how important it is to have a graduate school writing sample and to have a writing sample in your field of study. Very often our faculty mentors, depending on the phase of their research, are co-publishing with their students, and they're also jointly presenting their research with the students. All of that's coming back and tied back to their role as mentors. Other interventions and services. Again, our students are coming from first-generation backgrounds, so they do not have that familial network. They can't go to mom, dad, or grandmother to guide them in terms of where can I go on campus to get access to A, B, or C service. And so we've taken it upon ourselves to also identify on-campus resources for the students. But again, taking into context the backgrounds and the demographics of our students, we need to be very clear in terms of what is fee-based and what are free services, as well as the time commitment that's required, knowing very often that our students are committed to work. We need to ensure that the services that we're recommending are also flexible on the time so that the students can truly take advantage of the times that they are on campus. It's very important, again, to develop customized programs and services. So during the Summer Research Institute, or just the summer as a whole, the students are also enrolled in a graduate school preparatory seminar in which they address how to apply for graduate school. They develop their personal statements. Not only are they developing the statements, but we're taking them and introducing them to resources on campus, but as well as their allies on campus. Where are my safe places and who are my safe persons I can go to if I have any questions? So that happens in terms of their CV development, as well as their oral and poster presentation development. We understand that money and funding is always very challenging and are tight, and so the students, we partner with Princeton Review and other test-taking entities, and I focus a lot on corporate social responsibility. I've done lots of research on that. And these entities, corporate entities, are truly trying to find a place in which they can support students and or to students as a whole. And so I will always encourage that we tap into some of those resources. And to find alternative funding. The students need time first, they need money for stipends and housing and meals. And so there are ways in which we can identify sources for the students. Education abroad is one thing I'll talk about briefly. What I've done also is that I recently, for the past 3-4 years, I've taken students to Ghana, West Africa, understanding that global citizenship is key. And the structure of the program that I've developed, it's a 3-credit course, so they're getting credit for it. But it's also primarily online, knowing that the students need to work, so that the first component of the 4 weeks are taught online, and then we're in Ghana for 2 weeks out of the year in the summer. Again, 2 weeks missed work is very different from a 3-week experience. So just being very cognizant of the realities of the student and their resources, essentially. Finally, it's really, or second to last, is just to ensure that there are systems of accountability. I know that was mentioned previously. We hold ourselves accountable, we have a set of objectives, and we also ask the students to be accountable as well as the faculty mentors. Recognize their accomplishments. This is coming back to a safe space. We're trying to instill a positive sense of self. I had a student last week we met during our Lunch and Learn lecture, and she said it hurts so badly that my mom doesn't understand what a sociology degree is. and here I am graduating with this, and it's an accomplishment, but she can't truly applaud me the way in which I wish she would applaud me. Or a student last week also said that he told his parents that he got into a doctoral program of study, and they asked him, well, what hospital are you going to work with? So we're the network, right? We're that support network for the students. And so in conclusion, I'd just like to revisit some of the things that we talked about in terms of how to truly develop an effective program for diverse populations. And I thank you.
Okay, I think we made a really great point there, which is we can keep ourselves in check with our decisions and our evaluations, but we also need to keep each other in check, and we need the tools to do that. I know that sometimes I freeze and I don't know what to do in a situation where I don't find that whatever situation I'm in is up to the levels that we should be aiming for. And one of these action-orientated ways of doing this is bystander intervention training. And Alison Matthias is going to actually do the very brave thing of trying to give us like just a little snapshot of what this is in 15 minutes, but I encourage everyone to find further training on this, bring it to your institutions. There's some great organizations out there that do that.
Thanks, everyone. First, I just want to thank my panelists and Hazel for the invitation to be here. This is my first time at AGU, and I feel like I've spent the week kind of doing my own ethnographic observation of cultural practices at AGU. And I've also been thinking a lot about what brought me to my work on this team, but also to this point in my career. So I'm an associate professor of education at Cal State Los Angeles, and I think a lot of my comments are really going to dovetail nicely with Dr. Ned's presentation, both because I work at the type of institution that has the potential to really diversify workforces of all types, because I work at a campus that's 90% students of color, 70% first-generation college students. But I'm also here at this national conference as a white woman with a PhD because these systems are so embedded that they're very hard to disrupt. So I really do feel like part of my professional responsibility is to be making space in the academy in whatever way that means for people that don't share my same identities. And that's a huge part of bystander intervention. How do you stand up for people that are different than you? And how do you recognize how important it is to bring difference into your workplace? I also am at AGU as someone who, as an undergraduate, majored in geology and environmental studies, but then ended up teaching middle school science for 8 years. So what I'll also say is that teaching middle school is a lot of bystander intervention. And I spent a lot of time basically trying to explain to other people what scientists know. So I think that is part of, how do I do the advancing? Oh, it's the other keyboard. Thank you. Okay, so I think that's how I've ended up being lucky enough to be a part of the Advanced Geo team. So we have a 4-year NSF grant that is specifically looking at ways to work with the geoscience community to reduce sexual harassment and other forms of discrimination. So I'm the education researcher on this team, along with my colleagues, many of whom are here and are all really fabulous people. So I'm going to start by talking briefly about what this word culture means. I've been making note this week how many times I've heard this word used in different sessions at AGU and what people mean by it. I think that this might also really complement a lot of the sociological and psychological theories that I've seen used really valuably in valuable ways in different sessions. So I work a lot with anthropological perspectives. So anthropology is often thought about as the study of human culture, but culture is often used colloquially as a replacement term for something else that people mean. Often they mean national identity, ethnic or racial affiliation, but they're not really using culture in the way that anthropologists would mean. So a useful reframing that I think is valuable for people interested in changing their own workplace practice is to think of culture not as individual traits, but as repertoires of practice. So instead of labeling individuals as having certain traits that you think are cultural, it's to think about culture as practices that are historical and traditional, but they exist within groups. And just because something is historic and traditional doesn't mean it's good. So traditions can change. And cultural contexts are related to the people who create and maintain them. They don't exist outside or separate from practices. They only are passed down through generations if people repeat them. If we label groups too narrowly, it also really removes something very important, which is looking at intra-group diversity. This is especially important for members of underrepresented groups in the workplace because tokenization relies on people making assumptions and stereotypes based on bigger groups and not looking at the individual and what they're bringing to their workplace. So it's important to not reinforce stereotypes in the guise of trying to be culturally sensitive. And it's important to remember that culture is not static and it can change. So our team is really adopting and doing our best to commit to this understanding of intersectionality. And here's where I think my talk follows really nicely with Dr. Nudd's, because part of what I try to emphasize is that at-risk categorization is not about individuals, just like culture is not about individuals. Women are not at risk of harassment in the field because they're women. They're at risk of harassment because of sexist practices that put them at risk. Students of color are not at risk of not graduating with a geoscience degree because they're people of color. It's because they're attending institutions that were designed and maintained by middle-class white men, and the practices that involve education have to change to make space for other people. And none of these oppressions happen in isolation. A lot of them are still related to histories of colonialism and Western-centric ideas of knowledge and value, and white supremacy, and I won't go off about how we have a lot of examples of that in our everyday lives right now. But I could. I'll stop. So harassment and bullying in STEM workplaces are, I really do commend AGU as an organization to raising awareness about this among the scientific community. And I think the plenary on Wednesday was an excellent example of making this topic important and just institutionally recognizing that everyone needs to pay attention to this as something that's part of the geosciences community. So our project is part of efforts to focus specifically on women and their experience in the geosciences, but I also want to push us further to think about gender in a less binary way, and remind people of some of the comments that were made at that plenary, that sexist attitudes are usually associated also with heterosexism and cissexism, and all of these sort of narrowly define what it means to be a gendered person, and then what it means to be a scientist. So what are some things we can do? So I am getting to that, Hazel, I promise. So part of what we're trying to do with our project is suggest some ways to build a more inclusive workforce using phrases of intersectionality or theories. So, and Marianne talked about this earlier, that hierarchies in academia, and I think Brooke's presentation about networks also really reinforces this, that in the sciences, in academia, in any field that has a PhD associated with people who make it in their careers, it reinforces hierarchy. So we can't pretend that this doesn't exist. We need to just think about what we're doing with it. We do need to aim for more balance in gender ratios, and we have to address more this idea of masculinity, because there's also a lot of research from social psychology that shows that women also reinforce these stereotypes because they're often taking on certain behaviors and ways of expressing and doing gender that reinforce masculinity even if they identify as women. And we really have to look at how all of these isms are interconnected and how they create spaces that are even more difficult for people who have multiple oppressed identities to engage with their peers in the field, meaning the field of geosciences. And we do need to move beyond goals of legal compliance to culture change. So accountability and reinforcing the rules is absolutely important, and it's a really important place to start. But in order to prevent the problems in the future, we have to change the cultural practices we use. So that is why we need to focus on addressing the harassment and bullying instead of just pretending it's not happening. So I have seen some really great presentations this week that I think have brought these issues to AGU and really have focused on educational experiences and how to be more inclusive. So I've seen excellent work that's talked about neurodiversity and geoscience work, about making people with different physical abilities able to engage in field experiences, and just acknowledging that by bringing more people into our classrooms, we're also going to bring more people into the geosciences, and that will only benefit the field. Universal design as approach basically says, let's think about the most vulnerable people in our community and how do we make our space available to them. And then with those efforts, you're going to improve things for everyone. Adopting civility as part of being an ethical scientist, and then also adopting violations of those codes of conduct as synonymous with scientific misconduct. Running meetings in ways that include all voices and disrupt hierarchies. Our first talk already talked about that, so I will not belabor it. And addressing institutional and group-specific activities and practices, and this is really where this thinking about cultural practices as reinforced by groups is part of this. So as I mentioned, this is my first time at AGU. It's certainly not my first time at a large national conference, but I had never seen beer in the exhibit hall. So I'll just tell you that that is a cultural practice of AGU as a society. And those of you who started coming to this meeting when you were undergrads or graduate students, it probably now is just taken for granted that that's just how we do things here. But I'll tell you, as someone coming in as an outsider, it's something I noticed. It doesn't have to be good or bad, but it's important to look at how it might have impacts that are positive or negative. And that's the real thing, is just not accepting that's just how things are. If that's where you're relying, if you end up with, well, that's just how it is, usually people only say that after someone else has pointed out that maybe there's something bad about what we're doing. And that usually comes about because people feel helpless to change things. A lot of really good people feel helpless. So bystander intervention is something to help you not feel helpless. So we are drawing from these 5 Ds from the Hollaback bystander intervention, and my colleagues, several of them, gave some workshops this week that I hope some of you were able to attend. And that's part of what our project is doing, is developing geoscience-specific ways for people to practice these behaviors. And briefly, the 5 Ds that are suggested are direct intervention, so actually doing something, and really all of these, your decision making about what should you do in the moment really does have to involve self-reflection. So the person and human side of being a scientist is sometimes not emphasized in our discussion of our research findings or in the development of scientists, but it really is important. Or distracting, so sometimes distracting the offensive behavior or moving the target of an offensive behavior to a more safe space can be effective. And again, it's not helpful for people to put themselves in danger in order to help someone else. And especially if you're working in an isolated space like a field site, that the direct approach might not always be most effective. Delegate, seeking help from a third party. This is where attending to hierarchies is really important and where networks are really important. So knowing that if you're a student, there are faculty who you know will believe you and will take action to support you is great. If a woman knows that there is a male ally in her department, that is sometimes really necessary. Now that I have tenure at my institution, I'm really focusing on checking in with my new assistant professor colleagues, because I've had my own experiences of certain people being not the best to work with, and I want to see what I can do to protect them from those people. Delaying is about checking in with the person who's the target. So making sure that in your efforts to be seen as like a good person who's a social justice warrior, that you don't make it about you instead of about the person. So sometimes your intervention could actually draw more attention to someone, and that's not always what they want. So checking in with the person that you've witnessed experiencing something negative and asking them what they'd like to do, and document. So documenting the incident, and AGU's new commitment to reporting policies is one way of looking for examples of how to do this well. So in conclusion, the real goal here that the Advanced Geo team is working towards, and hopefully everyone else in this meeting, and I'm really happy that there are so many people in the room, is to think about how can theories like intersectionality help us think about things changing. So paying attention to our own personal roles that we play in certain workplaces or in the field as a whole, and thinking about how we can change our cultural practices for the better. And I'll leave you with this page of resources, some of which have already been up there, but I encourage you to check them all out and follow our project as well.
Thanks, Alison. So I guess I'll invite all of our panelists back up. Sorry, I should just have said stay up here. Can we have all of our panelists come up? And there's not a huge amount of space, but let's try and make sure that everybody's seen. There's 3 extra people who I'd love for them to introduce themselves to you and their great work. Are these microphones on? While they're getting settled, the question asking app on the AGU platform, you can actually go on there and upvote other people's questions, and then we get a sense of what questions the room really wants to hear the answers to, as well as those coming to the mic. Okay, so I guess, do we want to start with the 3 panelists at this end who have not yet introduced themselves?
Is this on? I think so. Hi, I'm Kuheli Dutt. I'm at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory at Columbia University, where I serve as the diversity officer. Did you want us to talk? Did you want us to talk about our work now or later? A little bit. Okay. So one of the things I do, I work to promote diversity and inclusivity at Lamont, and my own research focuses on implicit bias. And one of the studies that we worked on was looking at gender differences in letters of recommendation in the geosciences. And other fields like chemistry, biochemistry, psychology, medicine, they all have similar studies. And the results are equally depressing everywhere. Everywhere it's the same story, that men get much stronger letters than women get. Men tend to get more standout adjectives like brilliant and star and genius, and women tend to be described in more communal terms like reliable and nurturing and caring. Even more disturbing is the fact that both male and female letter writers are doing this. There is absolutely no difference. And we had a global data set that looked at more than 1,200 letters from 54 different countries, and this pattern was consistent across the board. So the issue here is, now of course, it's one thing that within letters of recommendations we have this problem, but the bigger picture is that this is about how women and minorities, how their contributions tend to be undervalued within the work that they do in the sciences. And this is part of a much bigger problem, as Marianne was talking about how we all have biases, and some of the studies she mentioned, whether it's CVs, teaching evaluations, job, anything, online courses, and so on. In every one of them, you'll see some sort of bias against women and minorities. And also, this isn't just limited to STEM fields. In fields like philosophy or classics, it's the same thing. The idea being that whenever there's a field where there's a perception of innate brilliance, that you need to have this raw talent and innate brilliance to excel, those are the very fields where women and minorities are stereotyped as not having that excellence. So that's something very key to keep in mind that transcends letters of recommendation. Having said that, in the interest of time, I'm going to give you if you've been asked to write a letter of recommendation, I'll just give you some tips on how to, what would be a good way to go about writing it, and also what you should not do. So one of the first things that you should do if someone asks you to write a letter for them is to identify the sort of skills that are necessary for the job. Creativity, problem solving, leadership skills, analytical skills, and so on. And when you do this up front, what it will help you do later on is reduce the usage of gendered language that comes to all of us implicitly, whether we like it or not. So that's a start. Another thing to keep in mind is that very often men tend to get hired for their potential and women for their actual accomplishments. And potential is nothing but giving credit to somebody for something they haven't yet done. So be mindful of that as well. Another thing that you should be mindful of is men are much more likely to mention their own accomplishments compared to women. And so make sure that you look at their accomplishments and that you talk about them. And the key thing to keep in mind is that you're not trying to do something like start writing stronger letters for everyone, but to recalibrate your scale so that equally qualified men and women receive letters describing them in similar language. That's something very, very key to keep in mind. Another thing that I often get asked about letters of recommendation is that, should we use words like hardworking and intelligent? And are those good words, or should we just avoid using those? Now, a majority of the letters that we analyze, that's about more than 1,200 letters, describe the candidates as hardworking and intelligent, regardless of whether they were male or female. But some letters went significantly above that, and others did not. So the key thing is not whether you should use certain words like hardworking or intelligent or not, but what's the best thing that you've said about this candidate, and does it adequately reflect their skills and their talents? Another thing that I want to bring up is that like I said earlier, this goes beyond just letters of recommendation. Letters of recommendation are just one piece reflecting a much larger bias that we experience in society, specifically against women and minorities. But when we become mindful in terms of how we describe women and minorities and their contribution towards in science, it will likely translate into a greater mindfulness of how we view their contributions overall. And that is what's ultimately going to help us move in the direction of the much needed culture shift of giving women and minorities the sort of value, the sort of credit and appreciation that we give routinely to male scientists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Erica Rogers from NASA. I work in our Chief Technologist office, and I work with other government agencies on our science and technology partnerships. Completely on the side and separate from my work at NASA, I'm on a research team. There are 2 social scientists and 2 physical scientists that participate on this team, and we put out surveys to the astronomical and planetary science communities. And we ask them about their personal experiences in the workplace regarding safety, harassment, and negative language that they hear while they're at work. And we analyze this data, and we find that women, as compared to men, mostly women, report more often verbal harassment and physical harassment. We find that people of color report more verbal harassment and physical harassment. And then when you look at the intersection of that data, you find that women of color most report feeling unsafe in the workplace because of race and gender. And so we look at that and we think, what is the environment that we're working in? What is the climate? What is the culture that we have in our environment at work? And if you don't feel comfortable, then how can you do your best work? And if you don't feel comfortable, you skip professional events, which are another line of questioning that we asked folks in these surveys. And people sometimes skip professional events because they feel unsafe. And then you're missing out on opportunities. And that is unfortunate, and then you cannot contribute back to our workplace environment. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to pass off.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jane Zelikova. I am a climate change scientist, and I'm also one of the co-founders of 500 Women Scientists, which is a global grassroots organization that is fighting to make science more inclusive, open, and accessible. Implicit bias is something that we think about a lot as an organization because we are an organization of women scientists from all over the world that have experienced different kinds of implicit bias and have our own implicit biases as well. In terms of what we do as an organization to address issues like this, what we have been able to do in the last 2 years since we started is grow this huge network of thousands and thousands of women, not just in the US, but all across the world, and not just in geosciences, but across all disciplines. If you are a self-identifying woman and a self-identifying scientist, you belong in our organization. And so this huge network gives a sense of belonging and a sense of being a part of a group and getting support in instances when there are negative impacts of implicit bias that any one person is experiencing. So there's the big network part that's really important. The other thing that we do is that we've been writing both local kind of pieces and national and international pieces to bring attention to these issues of gender discrimination, bullying, harassment in science, and bringing to the attention not just of the scientific community, but across kind of the more public sphere where we can talk about the issues that are within science. And if we can address these issues in science, I think it'll help us be more equipped to work for a better kind of more equitable world in and outside of science. The other thing that we do as an organization is we have local chapters where women can actually come together in person, and so that like global network can actually become a physical network, and women can, from their different disciplines, share their experiences, share what's going on, come up with solutions, and work together so that no one feels really scared because it's just their voice. It's their voice and the voice of many other women that are speaking out. And then because we have these women all over the world, they're able to take what they're learning as part of this group of other women back into their institutions and be that disruptive force that starts to push for change. So you're welcome to join us. We love supporters, and we love women scientists to join the organization. Thanks.
So with that, I think we're going to start opening up the floor for questions. We're going to be going back and forth. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to stand up at the mic. And we'll start with you, and then we'll move to online questions.
Hi, I work for an agency that gives out grant awards, and we had, as an intervention under implicit bias, we created a video that we asked all of our peer review panels to show right before the panel. And anecdotally, we heard some kind of disturbing information from one of our peer review leaders, and she said that after they showed the video, there were people on the panel who were, they were grousing about it. And then she said that she believes there's a clear nexus between that video and their sort of unusually vicious attacks on some of the people who were applying for the grants. And so our concern is that we're experiencing that problem that we've heard about with implicit bias, where sometimes you can undertake an intervention that will have the opposite result. So I guess I'm wondering, in terms of raising awareness, how would you respond to that concern?
Thanks. So if this workshop was online, those are much less effective than being in person with a human being. So I'm not sure what how it was actually run. I also think the good news about implicit bias is that we are all subject to it, and we are all committing it, if you will, every day. So I would think that the main focus should be, we're all doing this, how do we come to some sort of resolution, as opposed to you're being bad because you've got bias and you got to stop it.
So when we looked into the intervention for the bias that we were seeing in our peer review We actually consulted with a number of psychologists for that reason, that there are ways you can, there are studies showing that how, in some ways, you can actually reinforce the bias by how you talk about it. So we were, most of what they suggested to us was stick to the simple fact of the study and a statement that we were trying to obtain more diversity in our reviewer pool, and that's worked pretty well. So, and we have not seen a lot of pushback, and at least from the data that I showed, it's worked. So that was the advice we were given.
What I would say, and I know I've done this not in terms of marketing or promoting certain material, is just to ensure that the promotional material and or your team also has some measure of diversity in it, so that all groups can identify with the individuals that are being present or being talked about.
One thing I would add too, just as an educator, is that often we jump to interventions that are about something people should do without giving them space to self-reflect first. And I think that's a really important part of any work that's trying to improve diversity and inclusion. It has to start with people identifying their own positionalities, their own identities. And a lot of folks who have gone through STEM undergraduate and graduate preparation programs have not taken courses or had experiences that have allowed them to do that. So I think starting with who am I and who are my identities is important before you ask someone to start considering other people's.
Anyone else? Okay. Do you want to?
Yeah. I'm co-convener Blair Schneider. Upvote, so I know which questions you want the most. So this one kind of adds on to that, though. So thinking of it from faculty or administrators. So administrators at my institution deny implicit bias exists. How can I help them understand bias as a problem? So let's think top up, too.
Can I start? Can I make a comment about that one? So being in the community and being scientists, I think that the ways that we can influence or help is to look at the data. We can help with the analysis. If somebody's not doing that, we can jump in and do that, which is something that I said I do on the side, to influence the conversation. I think if you stand up and go through the data and make statements about the results, that will inspire other folks to do the same thing and to use that data to make policies.
I've served for a number of years on the university's Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, and I know that's always one aspect that we struggle with, because we are trying to implement certain interventions, and we know that the entire group isn't ready for interventions as yet. And so, I would always stress to start off with an empathetic standpoint, try to instill a sense of empathy. Through various scenarios, we've done that, or individual workshops, but it does have to start with that reflection on the individual before we can start addressing the needs of the entire group, because everyone is not at the same place and everyone is still in progress.
Thank you. Yes.
One more thing, and that is administrators are constantly in fear of lawsuits, so you might ensure that this isn't about surfacing illegal activity and lawsuits, and make sure it's just a conversation about how we're going to behave going forward.
And I just wanted to add to that point really quickly, following on Marianne's comment, and this probably also addresses the earlier question that we had, that, the quality of bias training is really important, because when you have certain administrators or general counsel, all they really care about is protecting the institution against lawsuits. And so the language that is used in some of those bias trainings, to be frank, they're really not very good. And so then when you start mandating people to attend those things and take those things, you're going to get pushback. It's understandable. So the issue is not so much to focus on the legality of certain behaviors, but trying to encourage people, as my colleagues are saying, to self-reflect and think about why they jumped to a certain conclusion or why they behaved a certain way. And I'd give a personal example. I work at Lamont, and and this is probably true of most scientists and geoscience institutions, people really respect data. So I could go around telling everybody, guess what, there's a bias in the way letters are written for men and women, and it would be, quote unquote, merely anecdotal. But the minute you put it together and put together 1,200 letters and publish it in Nature Geoscience, suddenly it becomes a fact and a reality that everyone has to take much more seriously. So depending on the institution you're working at and the culture, to use Allison's phrase, that is prevalent in that institution, you have to work using those specific aspects of that culture.
Okay, I think we'll take another question from the audience. I saw.
Great, thank you. So 2 things for me. One, in follow-up to my colleague here, that's a really frightening concept, because the whole idea of those conversations is to encourage less biased behavior. I think, for me, one of the things that we can think about is our goal in those conversations, and that is we are working to have civil and objective outcomes, not necessarily to sway the behaviors of people who are in other mindsets. It's an interesting consideration, though. But it also brought me to think about one of the things that I don't know that we addressed, and that is, what is the difference between implicit and explicit bias? It seems to me that respondent, not you, but the respondent was being biased in a very explicit manner and also in a very negative manner. So maybe thinking about our language more and how we use our language, and again, how we want to address it. I would respect that person, but still try to encourage them to be civil and even-handed. Last comment is reflecting Dr. Ned's comment, and I very much resonate with so many things that you said. It just spoke of being raised as a Black woman in this culture, and you rarely brag and you rarely promote yourself, and so it becomes ever more important, and this is for the lady from Damon, that we support each other. We have to not only write letters of recommendation for each other for employment positions, but also for awards, which means we have to nominate people for awards. And so we want to think broadly about the culture of support. And these talks were great, so thank you guys.
Thank you. I was just going to add to yours. I've been on the SPA advisory, not advisory, oh my goodness, SPA honors committee, and we've had this issue and we've had many discussions, so I would love to hear from the panel too. How, this is a question we're continually asked year after year. How do you write a good, effective letter of a put together nomination package for an award for someone, especially when we've had a lot of issues trying to get women and minorities nominated, let alone pushed forward to receive these fellow awards and honors.
She's a great minority scientist.
I'm going to add to that question another dimension, which is that we 500 Women Scientists have been seeing, more and more awards kind of come out, and like the majority of the awards are going to the men in the field, and we know that they're incredible women doing amazing work, and they're not being recognized, and then we hear they weren't nominated. And so part of it is that the award nomination process and what makes a strong versus not strong or not successful nomination is not clear. It's not transparent. We have no idea. Each institution has its own rules that it goes by. And so until the process is more clear, like more transparent and more honest, it's going to be really hard to break that code of what makes a successful nomination, in my opinion, but I don't know.
Something I would add is that there's a very strong attachment to ideas of meritocracy in science, that things are measured objectively, and that gets reinforced by understandings of what is excellence, and this starts throughout the pipeline. So there's been a lot of talk recently about removing the GRE subject test as a requirement for entrance to certain graduate STEM programs, and that's because a lot of data shows that these standardized assessments are very poor predictors of later scientific success. They're very good predictors of socioeconomic status. So starting early too about disrupting these ideas of what makes someone excellent is also something really important in changing those who's eligible for awards later on.
Thank you for your question, Marilyn. I happen to be the chair of the Honors and Recognition Committee for AGU. And one of the things we're doing to address this is we'll be having webinars on implicit bias training for all the selection committee members beginning next year, early January or February. Blair's also on the committee with me, so she can help correct me. We have also asked each AGU section, each of the 25 sections, to create a canvassing committee, and we're going to have a webinar with each of the sections to talk about how they're going to construct those. Right now, people have told me that within their section, the way they pick the selection committee is the incoming president gets to select. So the incoming president is going to select from his networks. And Brooks showed us that the networks are very different. Women have networks with men in them, and men have networks with men in them. And so if we don't break out of our networks, this will never change. So we need canvassing committees that have a diverse group of people on them, early career, various genders, race, ethnicity, so that we're looking beyond the usual suspect networks.
To Allison's point, in terms of moving away from the GREs, I know I am an advocate of the non-traditional means of assessment of the students, and in my letters of recommendations, what I try to highlight is the measure of grit or resiliency that a student may demonstrate. For example, I currently have a student, he's in a doctoral program, but this student was homeless for a while at the university, and he literally expressed to me that he was grateful to be on campus where there's a 24-hour library and he can sleep, and there's a gym in which he can take a bath in, and this student's leaving the university with a 3.3 GPA. So it needs to be contextualized in that way to say, well, this student has demonstrated a measure way beyond many others and a potential to exceed if he's able to earn a 3.2, 3.3, or 3.5 within that context of his lived reality. And so really contextualizing and the student, but that can truly only happen, and you can truly write a favorable letter of recommendation for scholarships and or for entrance into the universities if you have built that relationship of trust so that the student can come and have those conversations with you. And that's what I do. You know, I ask to meet with each student individually when they are asking for a letter of recommendation so I can get a little more about their story and the context in which they're coming from.
And to speak to transparency, to go back to what I was saying, that the Honors and Recognition Committee is also putting together a best practices document, and it's going to outline how we establish criteria for each of the awards and develop rubrics for them, so to try to increase transparency.
Yeah. And you know, AGU has a great webinar system, and so the how to write an effective nomination packet will be a part of that webinar for everyone to access in the future. So looking at this from a graduate student perspective, how can a graduate student succeed in a system, in a bias system, without becoming part of the problem? So for example, how can they network with the correct people?
Are there correct people? Yeah. I would intentionally network with everybody. You never know who's going to help you. I could tell you personal anecdotes of, you know, geophysicists who helped a clay sedimentologist get her first grant. So yeah, I would just ensure that you're networking with people and just be intentional about, be welcoming, and as Marilyn mentioned, civil. You know, very often people from underrepresented groups don't feel welcome and they don't feel part of an environment. So just smile at people in the halls is a good way.
So one thing.
Oh, sorry.
To add to Marianne's point, so one of the things that a piece of advice that I give postdocs at Lamont and some graduate students as well is that they should try to proactively build as many networks as they possibly can and not just wait for their advisor to introduce them to people, because at the end of the day, one of the things is they not only is it in their own self-interest to broaden their networks, but they don't want to have to leave graduate school or their postdoc term with having only one person be able to write them a good letter. So that's in terms of it's their own strategic thinking in terms of when they want to move forward to broaden their networks to make those connections with people.
And I think related to the previous conversation too about meritocracy, think about what kind of a career you want and find someone who's doing that kind of work instead of just following in the path of the person who might have the spotlight shown on them for, these one paper that got 1 million citations. I think in academia, the politics of citation is also really important, and I think that is what Brooke's work looking at AGU has shown as well. And there are efforts in particular groups of scholars to really amplify each other's voices in their fields really deliberately. So there are networks of trans scholars who are specifically working to cite each other. There's a hashtag, Cite Black Women, that's about making sure that other people in the field are also aware of who's doing work. And I think early career and graduate student researchers can start to build those networks among each other because you're going to be together in a cohort for several decades of your career. So starting where you are and building horizontal as well as vertical networks.
I was just going to say, as kind of the grassroots activist, at least outwardly at this table, I'll say something that someone said in a board meeting for 500 Women Scientists is that the institutions are working exactly the way they were intended to. They were just never intended to work for us. And I think back to being a graduate student, and I feel like the thing that really mattered to me was in being empowered to act and to push against the institutions that didn't feel like they fit me. And so I know it's really hard and it's scary to speak out alone, and you're a grad student and you don't know what is allowed and is not allowed, and you don't want to be labeled a troublemaker. So become a part of a group and then push against these institutions as a group instead of as an individual, because they are never intended to work for us and we have to dismantle them.
Wow, that's radical. I love that. And the more I think about this question, the more I love it. I've seen mentoring programs for students that basically are training students to adopt the prevailing culture. So let's not have mentoring programs that propagate the prevailing culture. And just even if you're not in a mentoring program, don't adopt the prevailing culture.
I have always encouraged my students to identify entities or organizations on campus that serve diverse populations. That will be one start. And then even if those organizations do not exist, to honestly do informational interviews with faculty and staff so you can start identifying who your allies are. And it's just like any other interviews, there's someone else who I can speak with. So really just follow the path of recommendations and referrals so you will know who are your safe persons and where are your safe places at any entity. It can be in the workforce and or at an academic institution.
So I'm approaching this more from the data, but I will say I think that just letting improved networks happen organically is not going to be enough. I think that's what we're seeing. When we started this, I was hopeful to see a difference pattern in kind of the younger generation. AGU is almost 50% women in their 20s, and it historically drops off, and we hope that attrition will be corrected. But we were hoping that the 20-year-old and younger networks would be a little more equal, and it's not happening. So I think it needs more push than just having it done organically. We need to think structurally how we help foster the right networks to begin with.
Thanks, Brooks. I mean, it's almost an empirical question. How can we make new networks? How can we broaden the networks? How can we open them up? And we can try different strategies and look at evaluations and see how that's going to work. It's kind of like they were hoping Brown versus the Board of Education would change the culture of the U.S. and it hasn't.
Do we have it? Yep.
Okay, this is actually a follow-up. The comment about having the students push back, I teach research methods. What I would love to have for my research methods class is some curriculum materials so I can teach them what's been covered here.
So the question was, or the comment was that you'd really like to have a curriculum to be able to share with your students from what we've discussed here and what's there. Is there curriculum out there? Is there a single place? I think I remember seeing on Twitter the 500 women scientists are building a resource center, but are there other ones we should point out as well?
So 500 Women Scientists has a resources page that has different bins of resources, including ones to combat sexual harassment, resources for science communication, and implicit bias training. So you can check that out. But there are many, many, many papers written about this, and I'm sure others on this panel know a lot more. So the resources are ample, but I'm sure everyone's busy. It's hard to dig through them. And hopefully there's a place that centralized everything.
Advanced Geo.
Yeah, Blair was noting that that is one of the intended outcomes of our project is specific information for people in your position. I guess I would also like to say, what does research methods mean for you? Because we have a lot of folks doing different kinds of research up here, so I'm just curious what type of a class that is. Or we can talk after. But in order to design curriculum materials, you really need to think about who is that for and how does that class look different across departments, across institutions. And something else I was thinking of earlier is that we also really need to address elitism across institutions. I think that is part of all of our work. I work at a state, a state regional comprehensive university, and I've met some folks here at AGU who are from UCLA who don't know where my campus is, and I'm literally 11 miles away. We have 29,000 students. And I know because of the institution I work at, I have this opportunity to really bring a lot of folks into the field, but I'm also aware when I write letters of recommendation that sometimes people at other institutions are not going to take my letter as seriously because of my affiliation. And I am not at my institution because I can't do work at other places. It's because that is where the work I want to do is located. These are the people I want to work with. So all of us need to work with each other and respect each other a little more, I think.
And one more resource for you is the SERC, S-E-R-C website. And I'm sorry, I don't know what that stands for, but if you look for Dave Moak, M-O-G-K, he's done a whole curriculum on ethics, and I think there's implicit bias training in the ethics.
I would also recommend, without just an entire overhaul of the curriculum, because that can be intimidating, honestly, it's identify case studies from diverse regions with diverse peoples, because research is being done all over the world, but it just so happens that we continue to reference the same sources and or communities. And so incorporating diversity into the research and or into your class, I know that, again, I've intentionally identified Ghana, West Africa as a place to do my research, in part to debunk the stereotypes that exist about quote-unquote Africa, because even when I still tell individuals, parents, and or other faculty and staff that I'm going to Ghana, they translate Ghana into the entire continent of Africa, right? So in my class, I know I have intentionally pulled resources from faculty at the universities there, and that's what I'm incorporating into my classes as my case studies.
So these two are similar, so I'm going to combine them. So we've talked about hiring criteria like SATs, H-index letters that are biased. So what can we do? Do we ignore them or do we compensate for them somehow? And then on that thought, what are your thoughts on blind proposal reviews? And that's for the whole panel.
So I'll address the second one about blind proposal reviews. And I personally think, I strongly support the idea, and I'd like to share a personal example. Because when I was putting together, when we were doing this study on letters of recommendation, it was something that this study had never been done for the geosciences, so this was the first study done for that. But I was also aware that me being a woman of color, being an administrator and a social scientist instead of a physical scientist, despite my PhD in the social sciences, would definitely open me up or subject me to a lot of bias in the review process. And so I was very relieved to find that Nature Geoscience offered a double-blind option, which is why I picked Nature Geoscience, because I knew that already, the fact that it was a study was one of the first of its kind was already, it would have a lot of scrutiny, but having a woman of color be the one leading and directing that study was just going to open up all kinds of bias. So yeah, I strongly support the idea of a double-blind option.
I think research shows NIH has done this, and double-blind studies in the Swedish Academy of Sciences, and the proportion of funding that goes to women goes up. And double-blind means that the reviewer doesn't know the name of the person on the proposal. And what's the other double part?
Vice versa, vice versa.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not sure if anyone here can speak to it, but if you can, please speak up. But I know that NASA has started doing double-blind studies for I think it's the Hubble Space Telescope program. And I'm not sure if they have results on how that has all, anything that's come out of that yet, but that's something we should definitely be looking to as a field and as an organization. I don't know. Any other comments?
Do we do this with AGU publications, Brooks?
So no, AGU publications are optional single blind. Many of our reviewers identify themselves, so it's optional for reviewers not to. So a couple thoughts. So certainly we've had a lot of discussions on this on the publications committee. One challenge is how, from a publications point of view, so in many ways it's perhaps easier on a proposal point of view from a funding point of view. On the publications, there's a number of complications. One is that what makes this meeting great is many of the results are first presented here by authorship groups, and we see that in where they're subsequently done, which makes double-blind complicated. The second is that the way scholarly publishing is moving is that, in fact, I just wrote a piece with 4 other people from DataCite and Make Data Count in Scholarly Kitchen earlier this week, that the publication is soon going to be linked to a bunch of other nested resources. In fact, I think that AGU is leading with a number of other publishers is having data sets related to publications cited and counted as part of the publications. And so if you're going to blind the paper, do you blind the data set too? And it just gets very complicated. And for the level of effort, is it going to make a difference? And I think one of the interesting things we found that I mentioned in the talk is that actually women first authors are significantly more accepted in AGU journals than male first author papers. In fact, you should want a woman on your paper because I think the data show that, as I showed there, that the diversity matters in acceptance rate. So that, like I said in the talk, it doesn't mean that the acceptance rate shouldn't have been higher and that we might be seeing be seeing bias in that. But I think the thing that we've been struggling, and this is the conversation we've been having in our publications committee and elsewhere, is the cost benefit versus the in actually blinding. There's a cost to actually blind all the papers and to blind them effectively, so that people don't say in our prior work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That makes that moot. And with all these connected resources, is there enough of a tangible benefit to do that? So ideally, it would be great to do it, but that's where we're up against is that cost benefit, and the cost is getting higher as the complexity of what is a scholarly publication grows, and the need to connect it to other resources like data and make data citations count. So there's a separate problem of how do you reward the people that create the data and create great data sets. That's also involved in our whole tenure promotion process as well. So we're trying to wrestle with that complexity, and if there are other ways aside, so I think we've taken the approach of other ways aside from double-blind. The Nature experiment was interesting. Nature did offer this, and I think the results, when you look at kind of aggregated all their double-blind experiment together, they found a little bit complicated. That actually, the actually rejection rate of double-blind papers was higher because there was a selection bias of what went in there. So they viewed that as a little complicated. But on the other hand, I think it was great that they offered the option of doing it and the experiment for doing that as well. So there were some good results that led to some good discussion and thinking that came out of that experiment. Sorry, that was a long, complicated answer, but it's a long, complicated issue.
Yeah. I'll give a really quick, short follow-up, which is that all of these are based on assumptions that people can somehow be unbiased, right? And I think what our panel should maybe have as a takeaway is that even if you have completely anonymous review, you still have bias. So, I think that's maybe where we need to come from is how are we addressing the bias that we have when we engage in any of the practices that are part of our work as scholars.
Okay, I think we have a question from the audience.
Yes, this would have been a suggestion or comment, except as I've listened to things, it has turned into a question. Namely, going back to the question from someone asking about what could we be doing in graduate school as graduate students, and the sad results that seems to obtain so far about the network structure. And that is, I had thought that the results wouldn't be that way, in part because I'm not in academia, but I do have occasional interns, and one's earned her doctorate and doing extremely well. Actually, both have doctorates. Two women, one African American, one Hispanic, and they're both very active in going back to their schools and other groups, crossing their backgrounds and talking about experiences and encouraging the people to be networking and networking outside of the traditional usual suspects. So I guess so it becomes the question of, is it just a matter that there aren't enough people like this pair, or that kind of activity is not as effective as I was thinking?
From our end, that's the advantage of 1 million co-author networks, is that you average out, or you get a holistic view of the overall behavior. That's not to say that there's lots of variation within that, that overall average. Some good, but some great, some less great.
Okay. How do you handle accusations that you only received an opportunity because the program was looking to increase diversity, not considering that you were qualified for the position?
Civility. I mean, what is our initial assumption? You don't belong here. So what if we could make our initial assumption, everybody belongs here?
Yeah, also, I think some things that we mentioned in our paper and talk about is that you can shoot for more diversified groups, and so that folks don't feel like the one and only. And so shooting for more than 30% representation and continuing that upward to have more diverse populations in your groups around you and in the work that you do can lead to better results. And then folks' opinions are incorporated more consistently and more equitably.
I was on a panel yesterday where a sociologist was also talking about how even when we diversify our groups, we will still have some people who are the one and only. So that's where it's really important to have allies and advocates and accomplices who, this other person who's probably the same person who doesn't believe implicit bias exists is not going to be convinced, that yes, I'm XYZ, but also I'm a really good scientist. You need other people to be pointing out your expertise in the space to overcome that person's voice. I mean, quite honestly, that person has extreme bias that they need to address. That's their own personal problem. It is not the additional labor required of an underrepresented member of a community to defend their own humanity and their own expertise. So other people need to do that with and for them.
That's a very real scenario. It's an extremely real scenario, and I know my students have dealt with that consistently. And just going back to what was said before, it's the support network, it's the peer network of mentors and your faculty mentors. But as I mentioned in my talk, one of the things that we try to work on is self-esteem. And I try to impart to my students that they truly are worth it, that they truly are valuable, and that they did get into whatever respective programs on their own merit. So it's just really that self-confidence that I think part of our job is to try to impart that upon the students, and then to introduce them or help facilitate those networks, those mentorship networks and allyships.
And if you don't believe it's happened, I've had people ask me that at AGU, suggest that I got a position that I had in the past because I was a woman. So it happens here. And it's great to have allies then come up and reassure that, no, that's not the case. I think I deserved it. Yeah. I continue to be here. So
I mean, what a devastating thing to say to somebody, that you don't belong here.
Yeah. So we have time for one more question, and so we'll take it from the audience.
Hi. So my question's kind of about getting severely underrepresented people involved in like science and things like that. So kind of my background is like, I'm Canadian, Saskatchewan. There is about a 10% Indigenous population, Indigenous First Nations population there. And I can't name a single First Nations Indigenous person like in my science community, nor do I know anyone who knows like anyone else of that. And like I would love to get like people with that background involved, but I'm also really scared to go in as like the privileged white person and like saying like, hey, you should do this, and I want to be respectful, you know, and like I'm just not too sure how to get those people involved, and you know, so I'm just kind of looking for tips on that. If that makes sense?
I have some names. I can share with you.
Well, I want to acknowledge that fear that you just identified, I have it too, it's real. It's like you, as a privileged white woman, I have a lot of privilege, and I am pretty scared to talk about certain things like race or gender because I don't know the language, I'm new to kind of the whole idea. I'm really afraid to mess up, and I'm afraid to hurt someone's feelings. So like acknowledging that we all kind of have those fears is a good first step, just to like give each other a little bit of a break. And if the person continues to like use the wrong pronouns or dismiss your like your critique, then I think that's more intentional. But I think there's just we need to give ourselves a little bit of space to like maybe mess up a little because we're learning, and recognize that we have to come on board pretty quickly though and learn actively. So that's like that part. And then I use Twitter a lot, and I feel like Twitter has been a really good place for me to find people because it's like deficit model, like I don't know anyone, so they must not exist. I think that's probably not helpful and it's not constructive. But if you're on Twitter, it's been a really great place, especially science Twitter, to find amazing people from all kinds of diverse backgrounds to participate in collaborations or reach out to students, and that I've used Twitter a lot.
I might add to that really quick. Two things that I found really helpful is when I go talk to groups and I know that I'm the person of privilege, I start by acknowledging it, and I start by acknowledging my intent. My intent is to be there as an ally, and my intent is to be here to help. But I think I was at a talk recently, and they were talking about, it was from the NSF, and they were talking about the purpose of the broadening impacts. And so making sure that we're not just swooping into these groups and taking what we want from them and then not leaving them with anything. I mean, this has to be a partnership. So if you want to go work with these groups, you need to make sure you've identify what is the purpose of this in advance. What do we give back? What are we sharing? And how are we evolving together as a community, and not just coming in, this is how you should do science. Have a purpose.
That's, it's some of my work. I always advance the concept of a multi-stakeholder perspective, meaning that you understand who your target audience is and truly identifying someone within that group to be your partner. I know when I travel abroad and I do some of my research in terms of service, it's not just service, but it's really partnerships. And even the language that we're using, when I spoke previously about reframing or reconstructing the language that we use, it does take some effort for us to understand and to do the research, but the language and partnerships and finding a person within the group is always advantageous.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to take one point of privilege as a chair and say not just, thank you to everyone and everyone, but I know a comment that has come up a number of times when we've had panels like this in the past is where can I find graduate students that are diverse and really good and educated. And as a previous McNair scholar, and as I'm always reminded, always a McNair scholar for life, I have to say that program is a fantastic program to go find students. We always had a summer that we got to do research, as you talked about, but there are more than one, there's more than one summer in a 4-year degree program or a 5-year degree program. So if you have, I know a lot of us have paid internships for the summer, reach out to the different McNair programs. They're all throughout the country, and there's a lot of really great students there just looking for opportunities. And then have them come, and join you for graduate school. And then have them, support them throughout the rest of their career. We're always, So thanks everyone so much. I know this is the end of the week. We're all tired. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for a great discussion and panel.